Hi, welcome. Ethan Hayes adjusted his silk tie and the reflection of the gleaming elevator doors, a smug satisfaction settling deep in his chest. Beside him, Tiffany Maxwell, his fiancée, reapplied a layer of Chanel's pirate red lipstick, her diamond engagement ring catching the light and scattering tiny rainbows across the polished steel. The ring was 2 carats, meticulously chosen, a tangible symbol of his success. Everything in his life was meticulously chosen. "Do you think Amelia will be there?" Tiffany asked, her voice a practiced, breathy purr. She snapped her compact shut, the sound echoing Ethan's own sense of finality. Ethan's smile tightened. "Chloe and Amelia were close in college, but I doubt it. Our worlds don't exactly overlap anymore." He let the words hang in the air, weighted with everything he didn't say. My world ascended. Hers stayed behind. The divorce had been 2 years ago, a clean surgical cut. He told himself it was for the best. Amelia, with her gentle spirit and her little hobbies, pottery, gardening, dreaming of a small, sustainable design business, was an anchor holding him back. He was a shark in the corporate world of finance, and he needed a partner who could swim in the same predatory waters. Amelia wanted to save the world with compostable packaging. He wanted to conquer it with leveraged buyouts. Tiffany was his perfect co-conspirator. She understood the language of power lunches, the importance of a Hampton share, and the subtle art of social climbing. She was a beautiful, ambitious accessory, and she made his life look exactly the way he wanted it to look on paper. The elevator opened onto the penthouse suite of the St. Regis overlooking the glittering expanse of Manhattan. Their friends Ben and Chloe were getting married at a sprawling estate in Newport, and this pre-wedding cocktail party was the official kickoff. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of influential chatter. Ethan, darling, Chloe, the bride-to-be, rushed over, a vision in white silk. And Tiffany, "You look breathtaking." Tiffany beamed. "We wouldn't miss it for the world." Ethan scanned the room, a king surveying his court. He saw hedge fund managers he'd outmaneuvered, rivals he'd crushed, and women who now looked at Tiffany with a sharp glint of envy. This was his victory lap. He had methodically built this life brick by gilded brick over the ashes of his quiet, comfortable marriage. He remembered the final argument with Amelia, her eyes wide with a hurt he'd refused to acknowledge. "But why, Ethan?" she had whispered, standing in the living room of their modest suburban home, a home she had lovingly decorated with handcrafted furniture and pots of thriving herbs. "I thought we were happy." "Happy isn't enough, Amelia," he'd said, the words tasting like ash. "Even then, I want more. I deserve more." He had believed it then, and he believed it now. He'd traded quiet contentment for thrilling success. He'd traded Amelia's soft, calloused hands for Tiffany's perfectly manicured ones. It was, by every metric he valued, a significant upgrade. "Did you hear who's sponsoring the champagne bar?" Ben the groom clapped Ethan on the back, pulling him from his reverie. "Julian Devo." Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "The Julian Devo, the tech mogul. What's his connection to you?" Ben laughed. "Not to me, my friend. To Chloe. Apparently, he's a close friend of one of her old college buddies, a major investor in her friend's new company. He's a surprisingly down-to-earth guy for someone who could buy this entire city block with his pocket change." Ethan felt a familiar thrum of ambition. An introduction to Julian Devo could be game-changing. He was a legend, a recluse who had built a tech empire from his garage and was now a titan of industry and philanthropy. "Which friend?" Tiffany asked, her eyes already scanning the room, no doubt calculating the potential social capital. "Amelia," Ben said casually, taking a sip of his drink. "Amelia Hayes. You remember her, right, Ethan?" The name hit Ethan with the force of a physical blow. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, the celebratory chatter fading to a dull roar in his ears. He turned to Ben, his carefully constructed composure threatening to crack. "Amelia. My Amelia. Yeah, man. She's here somewhere." Ben gestured vaguely towards the crowded terrace. "Chloe said she's doing incredibly well. Started some eco-design firm that's apparently taking the world by storm. Devo is her primary backer. Crazy, right?" Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. It wasn't possible. Amelia, the woman who cried when a plant died, the woman who thought a successful weekend was perfecting a sourdough starter, was mingling with billionaires. The floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet. Tiffany squeezed his arm, her nails digging in slightly. Well, isn't that quaint, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Good for her, finding a rich benefactor. But Ethan wasn't listening. He was staring at the doors to the terrace, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. He had written the final chapter of their story himself, casting her as the forgotten, heartbroken wife. It had never occurred to him that she might have started a whole new book without him, and from the sound of it, her new story was a bestseller. The Newport estate was a monument to old money, a sprawling Gilded Age mansion with manicured lawns that rolled down to meet the churning Atlantic. The air was crisp and salty, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the Manhattan penthouse. Yet for Ethan, the feeling of suffocation had only intensified. He had spent the entire night replaying Ben's words, each syllable a small sharp jab at his ego. Tiffany, sensing his distraction, had become increasingly possessive, her hand a constant branding presence on his arm. Stop thinking about her, she'd hissed in the car on the way over. This is our weekend. We are the power couple here, remember? He remembered. It was the role he had written for them. But now the script felt flimsy, the lines hollow. As they walked towards the grand ballroom where the ceremony was to be held, Ethan couldn't stop scanning the impeccably dressed crowd. He was looking for a ghost, the ghost of the woman he thought he knew. He expected to see her looking lost, perhaps a little weathered, a woman out of her depth in a world of such opulence. And then he saw her. She was standing near a large marble fountain talking to the bride's mother. She wasn't lost. She was luminous. The years since their divorce had not weathered her. They had refined her. Her hair, which she used to tie back in a simple, practical ponytail, now fell in soft, elegant waves around her shoulders. She wore a deep emerald green dress that clung to her figure in a way that was both sophisticated and undeniably alluring. It was a color she'd never worn when they were together, claiming it was too bold. But the most profound change was in her posture. The slight apologetic slump he had never noticed until it was gone was replaced by a straight-backed, easy confidence. She laughed at something, the older woman said, a genuine, uninhibited sound that seemed to cut through the polite murmur of the crowd. It was the laugh he remembered from their first date, a sound he hadn't heard in years. A wave of something hot and unfamiliar washed over him. It wasn't just surprise. It was a confusing, unwelcome cocktail of regret and jealousy. He, Ethan Hayes, the man who had everything, was jealous of the life his ex-wife had built without him. Is that her? Tiffany's voice was a sharp whisper beside him. He could feel her assessing Amelia from head to toe, her eyes lingering on the simple but clearly expensive cut of the dress, the single elegant pearl earring, the radiant glow of her skin. The dress is nice for her. The faint praise was a sharper insult than any overt criticism. It was Tiffany's way of re-establishing the hierarchy, but the barb missed its mark. Ethan was too transfixed. Amelia turned then, her eyes sweeping across the garden, and for a heart-topping second they met his. There was no flicker of pain, no hint of longing, just a brief, polite moment of recognition, followed by a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she turned back to her conversation as if he were just another guest, a stranger in a well-tailored suit. That casual dismissal stung more than any tearful confrontation ever could have. He had expected to be a looming presence in her life, a painful memory she couldn't shake. Instead, he felt like a footnote she had barely bothered to read. "Let's go get a drink," he said abruptly, pulling Tiffany towards the outdoor bar. He needed the familiar burn of scotch to steady his nerves. As the bartender poured his drink, he watched her from across the lawn. She was now talking to a distinguished-looking man with silvering hair and a calm, commanding presence. The man listened intently, his focus entirely on her, a small fawn-eyed smile playing on his lips. He touched her elbow gently, a gesture of easy intimacy, and she leaned into him, her body language speaking of trust and comfort. Who was that? An associate, a friend? The question gnawed at him. She certainly cleaned up well, Tiffany commented, sipping her champagne. I suppose having a billionaire on your arm will do that for a girl. Ethan choked on his scotch. What did you say? Tiffany rolled her eyes, a gesture of impatient superiority. Oh, please, Ethan, don't be naive. I had my assistant do a little digging this morning. Her company, Verdant Living, is a darling of the sustainability sector, and her primary investor, the man who sits on her board and owns 40% of the company, is none other than Julian Devo. They've been seen at several charity galas together. The society pages are calling them the eco-power couple. She took another delicate sip. It seems your little homemaker learned how to play the game after all. Ethan's knuckles were white where he gripped his glass. He looked back at Amelia and the silver-haired man. He was watching them with a new horrifying clarity. The man's suit was impeccably tailored, but understated. His watch was a PC Philippe, but not a flashy model. He exuded a quiet power that dwarfed Ethan's own performative success. This was him. This was Julian Devo. And he wasn't just her benefactor. The way he looked at her, the way she smiled at him, it was a language Ethan knew intimately, a language he and Amelia had once spoken fluently before he had forgotten how. He was looking at Amelia and her new husband. The wedding ceremony was a beautiful affair held in a rose garden overlooking the ocean. The scent of salt and roses mingled in the air as Chloe and Ben exchanged their vows. Ethan stood beside Tiffany, a hollow man in a bespoke suit. He could feel the weight of Tiffany's stare, her sharp, analytical gaze boring into the side of his head. She wasn't just his fiancée anymore. She was his warden, silently daring him to show a single crack in his facade. He couldn't focus on the vows. His mind was a maelstrom, replaying the image of Amelia with Julian Devo. It was one thing to hear that she was successful. It was another entirely to witness it, to see the living, breathing proof that her world had not ended with his departure. In fact, her real life seemed to have begun right at the point he'd declared theirs over. The officiant, a warm, charismatic woman, was personalizing the ceremony. Chloe and Ben are so grateful to have all of you here, the people who have shaped them. They want to give a special thanks to their mentors, the people who have guided them, not just in their careers, but in love. Ethan's stomach clenched. Ben, of course, has his father to thank. And Chloe, the efficient beamed, turning towards the front row, wants to acknowledge a woman whose resilience and vision have been a profound inspiration to her. A woman who, after facing her own crossroads, built a new path, not just for herself, but for a more sustainable future. We are so honored to have her and her husband with us today. Please join me in celebrating Amelia Hayes and Mr. Julian Devo. A ripple of polite, appreciative applause went through the crowd. Heads turned, Ethan felt hundreds of eyes on him. Or maybe it was just his own paranoia. He watched as Amelia, seated in the front row, gave a small, humble smile, while Julian placed a hand over hers, his pride in her evident to anyone who looked. The name spoken aloud in this public forum was a death nail to the narrative Ethan had so carefully crafted. Amelia Hayes and Mr. Julian Devo. It wasn't just a business arrangement. The efficient had said husband. The word echoed in the cavernous space of Ethan's skull. Husband. Tiffany's grip on his arm was like a vice. Smile. She breathed, her voice a low, dangerous command. Everyone is looking. He forced his lips into a semblance of a smile. It felt like stretching cold clay. He was an actor in a play he hadn't auditioned for, and he had just forgotten all his lines. He saw it all now. The quiet confidence, the expensive but understated dress, the presence in the front row. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a lucky break. This was her life. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. He registered the exchange of rings, the kiss, the triumphant recessional, but it all felt like it was happening behind a thick pane of glass. His reality had been reduced to a single searing fact. Amelia was married to a billionaire, a man whose net worth was so vast. Ethan's own considerable wealth was like a child's piggy bank in comparison. A man known not just for his fortune, but for his intellect, his foresight, his quiet philanthropy. He hadn't just been replaced. He had been rendered utterly and completely insignificant. At the cocktail hour that followed, the atmosphere was jubilant. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and ludicrously intricate canopies. Ethan felt a desperate need to escape, but Tiffany was already steering him towards a small group of people. That's Marcus Thorne, she whispered, her eyes gleaming with ambition. He runs the acquisitions department at Sterling Cooper. You need to talk to him. For the first time, the prospect of networking, of climbing another rung on the ladder, felt nauseatingly pointless. What was the point of his little kingdom when a true emperor was in the room? But he played his part, shaking hands with Marcus, exchanging pleasantries, his voice sounding distant and foreign to his own ears. His eyes kept drifting, searching for the emerald green dress. He found her near the raw bar, laughing with a small group of people. Julian was by her side, his arm resting lightly on the small of her back. He wasn't showing her off like a trophy the way Ethan so often did with Tiffany. He was simply with her, a quiet, unshakable unit. Ethan excused himself from the conversation with Marcus Thorne, ignoring Tiffany's furious glare. He walked to the bar and ordered another scotch. Neat. As he brought the glass to his lips, he caught his own reflection in the mirror behind the bar. He saw a man who looked successful, confident, in control. But it was a lie. He was a fraud. His entire life was a carefully curated illusion of victory. And the one person who was supposed to be his vanquished foe had just exposed it all without saying a single word. The truth was a bitter pill. He hadn't left Amelia because she was holding him back. He had left her because he had been too small to see the size of her dreams. The seating chart at a wedding reception is a masterclass in social engineering. A delicate web of alliances, old flames, and potential business deals. When Ethan and Tiffany found their table, a small, elegant card bearing their names, Ethan's blood ran cold. Table 7. And directly across from them, 2 other name cards, Mrs. Amelia Devo and Mr. Julian Devo. It was a deliberate act. Chloe, in her bridal bliss, had either committed a monumental act of social cruelty or was a master strategist. Perhaps she thought enough time had passed. Perhaps she wanted to force a reconciliation. Or perhaps, Ethan thought with a sickening lurch, she was simply acknowledging the new reality. Amelia was now in a social stratosphere that required a seat at the prime table, and as her ex-husband, he was a necessary, awkward appendage. "Oh, this is just perfect," Tiffany muttered, her voice tight with fury as she slid into her seat. Her smile was a slash of red, a warning sign. "Just breathe, Ethan. We are going to be gracious, charming, and completely unbothered." It was a tall order. Being unbothered was the last thing Ethan felt. He felt like a bug under a microscope. A moment later, they arrived. Amelia moved with an unhurried grace that he now recognized as the byproduct of genuine self-assurance. Julian pulled out her chair for her, a small, courteous gesture that felt both old-fashioned and incredibly intimate. "Ethan, Tiffany," Amelia said, her voice calm and even. There was no malice in it, no triumph. It was the polite acknowledgement of a former acquaintance. "It's been a while." "Amelia," Ethan managed, his own voice sounding rough. "You look well." It was the understatement of the century. She looked magnificent. "Congratulations on your engagement," she added, nodding towards Tiffany's ring. Tiffany, seizing the opportunity to flaunt, held up her hand. "Thank you. Ethan has impeccable taste." The implication was clear. He chose this. He chose me. Julian extended a hand across the table to Ethan. His grip was firm, his eyes a startlingly clear blue. They were intelligent, discerning eyes that seemed to see right through Ethan's expensive suit and into the hollow space beneath. "Julian Devo, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. I've heard a great deal about Amelia's past, and I'm grateful for the journey that led her to me." It was a master stroke of diplomacy, both disarming and utterly devastating. In one sentence, he had acknowledged Ethan's existence, relegated him to the past, and declared his own victory, all with a warm, genuine smile. Ethan felt like he'd been checked in a game of chess he didn't even know he was playing. The conversation that followed was a slow, agonizing torture. Tiffany, determined to prove her worth, tried to engage Julian in a discussion about the stock market, dropping names of tech companies and financial trends. "I'm fascinated by the volatility in the crypto space," she said, trying to sound knowledgeable. "What are your thoughts on the long-term viability of decentralized finance, Julian?" Julian gave her a patient smile. "My thoughts are that I employ people far smarter than myself to worry about it. I'm much more interested in the long-term viability of our planet." He then turned his full attention to Amelia. "Speaking of which, darling, did you tell them about the new seaweed polymer you're developing? It's extraordinary." Amelia's face lit up with a passion Ethan hadn't seen since the earliest days of their marriage. "Oh, it's still in the early stages, but the tests are promising. We think we can create a fully biodegradable packaging material that's not only strong and waterproof, but actually enriches the soil as it decomposes." She looked at Ethan, a flicker of the old, shared excitement in her eyes. "Remember that idea I had for using mushroom mycelium? This is like the next evolution of that." He remembered. He remembered sitting at their kitchen table, her eyes shining as she sketched designs on a napkin, talking about changing the world, and he remembered his response. "That's a sweet hobby, Ames," he'd said, patting her hand condescendingly before turning back to his quarterly reports. "But let's leave the world saving to the professionals." The memory slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. He had been the professional, and she was the one sitting next to a billionaire who called her ideas extraordinary. "How fascinating," Tiffany said, her voice flat. "So, you make fancy garbage bags." The air grew thick with unspoken tension. Julian's smile didn't waver, but his eyes grew cool. Amelia, however, simply laughed, a light, easy sound. "Something like that. But we're hoping they're the kind of garbage bags that help ensure we have a world left to put garbage in." She then gracefully changed the subject, asking Tiffany about her work in PR, her tone devoid of any sarcasm. Amelia was bulletproof. Tiffany's petty barbs, which would have once reduced her to tears, now slid right off her. She was encased in a quiet confidence that her new life and her new husband had given her. Ethan felt a desperate primal urge to reclaim some semblance of his old power. "So, Julian," he said, leaning forward, "I'm in finance, Hayes Capital. We've been making some aggressive moves in the tech acquisition space. I'm sure you understand the value of a hostile takeover when a company is underperforming." He wanted to sound like a peer, a fellow predator, but the words came out sounding brutish and clumsy. Julian took a slow sip of wine, his gaze unwavering. "I do understand it," he said, his voice soft, but edged with steel. "I also understand the value of building things up rather than tearing them down. It tends to yield a better return in the long run, in business and in life." The final words were aimed directly at Ethan's heart. It was a clean shot, delivered with surgical precision. The rest of the dinner passed in a haze of polite, meaningless chatter. But the lines had been drawn. Ethan and Tiffany, with their talk of acquisitions and volatility, were the demolition crew. Amelia and Julian were the architects building a new, better world. And Ethan was beginning to understand with horrifying clarity which side he had chosen and all that he had destroyed in the process. The wedding band was loud, playing a generic but dable set of pop hits. The dance floor was a swirl of pastel silks and dark suits. Tiffany, ever the performer, was in her element. She pulled Ethan onto the floor, her body moving with a practiced, fluid grace, her smile bright and dazzling for the benefit of their audience. "Dance with me, darling," she commanded, her voice a cheerful whisper that didn't quite mask the steel beneath. "We need to look like we're having the time of our lives." Ethan complied, his body moving on autopilot. He held her, spun her, smiled when he was supposed to smile, but his eyes kept betraying him, drifting back to table 7. Amelia and Julian weren't dancing. They were sitting close together, deep in a quiet conversation, their heads bent towards each other. Occasionally, Julian would laugh, a deep rumbling sound, and Amelia would touch his arm. They were in their own world, an impenetrable bubble of shared intimacy that a crowded dance floor couldn't touch. He remembered dancing with Amelia at their own wedding. They had been clumsy, laughing as they tripped over each other's feet. They hadn't cared who was watching. Their joy had been for them alone. With Tiffany, every moment felt like a performance, every smile a calculated move. As the song ended, Tiffany fanned her face. "I need a picture. The lighting here is perfect." She pulled out her phone, expertly finding her angle, and held it up for a selfie. "Smile, Ethan." He forced another smile. The flash went off, momentarily, blinding him. Tiffany immediately began tapping at the screen, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The caption has to be perfect," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Celebrating love with my love. No, too cliché. The future Mr. and Mrs. Hayes." "Yes, that's better." Assertive. Ethan watched her, a sudden, jarring sense of detachment washing over him. He saw her not as his fiancée, but as a stranger obsessed with crafting a narrative. Their entire relationship was a series of carefully curated photos, witty captions, and strategic social appearances. It was a brand, not a bond. He excused himself, needing air. He walked out onto one of the stone terraces. The cool night air a welcome relief. The sound of the ocean, a steady, rhythmic crash, was a soothing counterpoint to the chaos in his head. He overheard 2 women talking near the balustrade. He recognized one as a prominent art dealer from New York. "Oh, and her company is truly revolutionary." the art dealer was saying. Amelia Devo is the real deal. She has more integrity and vision in her little finger than most of the CEOs I know. I heard her ex-husband is here. The other woman said in a conspiratorial whisper. The finance guy? Can you imagine being the man who let that woman go? And for what? That little PR girl who's been posting selfies all night. The words were like daggers in his back. He slipped away before they could see him, his face burning with a shame so intense it was almost physical. He retreated to a quieter part of the estate, a small secluded garden lit by fairy lights. He needed to think to process the utter demolition of his reality. Everything he had defined as success, his wealth, his career, his beautiful fiancée, now felt like cheap imitation gold. He had strived for the appearance of a perfect life while Amelia had quietly gone and built a real one. His phone buzzed. It was Tiffany. Where are you? People are noticing. Another buzz. Marcus Thorne was asking for you. You're embarrassing me. And another. Ethan, get back here now. He ignored the messages, sinking onto a cold stone bench. He thought about Amelia's business, Verdant Living. He remembered her excitement, her late nights sketching ideas, her belief that she could make a difference. He had called it a hobby, a distraction. He had starved her dreams of the one thing they needed to grow, his belief in her. And now another man was watering them, and they were flourishing into a forest. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path made him look up. It was Tiffany, her face a mask of cold fury. There you are, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. What do you think you're doing? Hiding in the bushes like a child? You are ruining everything. I just needed some air, Tiffany, he said, his voice weary. Don't lie to me, she snapped. This is about her, isn't it? You're humiliated. I can see it on your face. You can't stand that your mousy little ex-wife managed to land a bigger fish than you did. Her words, so blunt and transactional, struck a nerve. Is that all this is to you, Tiffany? A competition? Who landed the bigger fish? Of course it is, she said, her voice rising. That's what it's always been. We won, Ethan. We have the better life, the better future. Why are you letting her get to you? She's nothing. She just got lucky. But he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it wasn't luck, it was worth. Amelia had an intrinsic worth that he had been too blind to see. And Julian Devo, a man who could have anyone or anything in the world, had seen it clear as day. Maybe we didn't win, he said quietly, the thought taking shape as he spoke it. Maybe we just chose a different prize. Tiffany stared at him, her perfectly painted lips parted in disbelief. What is that supposed to mean? It means I'm tired, Tiffany, he said, looking not at her, but at the distant, indifferent stars. I'm tired of the performance, of the captions and the pictures, and the constant exhausting effort of it all. The anger in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of fear. She had built her future on the foundation of their partnership, on the brand of Ethan and Tiffany. She was seeing the first terrifying cracks appear in that foundation. Don't be ridiculous, Ethan, she said, her voice softening slightly, becoming persuasive. You're just emotional. It's the wedding, the open bar. Let's go back inside. We'll dance. We'll smile. And tomorrow, this will all be forgotten. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. The gilded cage he had so proudly constructed for himself suddenly felt very small and very, very cold. And for the first time, he was seriously considering how to get out. The party was beginning to wind down. The older guests had departed, leaving the dance floor to the most determined revelers. Ethan had returned to the ballroom with Tiffany, but the chasm between them was now a palpable thing. They stood together, but they were miles apart. He was going through the motions, a ghost at the feast, his mind elsewhere. He needed to speak to her, not to reclaim her, not to apologize in the hopes of a second chance, but to understand. He needed to hear it from her. He needed to know how the quiet, unassuming woman he had married had transformed into this powerhouse of grace and success. He saw his chance when Julian was pulled away by the groom for a final celebratory cigar on the ver. Amelia remained at the table, sipping a glass of water, a small, serene smile on her face as she watched the last of the dancers. I'll be right back, he told Tiffany, his voice leaving no room for argument. He walked over to the table, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He felt like a boy approaching his first crush, clumsy and uncertain. Amelia, he said, his voice softer than he intended. She looked up, her expression unreadable. Ethan, Can we talk just for a minute? She hesitated, then gave a slight nod, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. He sat down, the space between them charged with 2 years of unspoken history. I just wanted to say congratulations, he began, fumbling for the right words on everything. Your company. It's incredible. I'm happy for you. To his surprise, he found that he meant it. Beneath the layers of shock and bruised ego, there was a genuine spark of pride. A real smile touched her lips. Thank you, Ethan. That means something. How did you do it? He asked, the question raw and honest. After I left, I never imagined. She looked at him, her eyes clear and direct. There was no pity in them, only a calm, reflective wisdom. In a way, Ethan, I did it because you left. When you were gone, there was this huge silent space. At first, it was terrifying. It was filled with all my insecurities and all the things I thought I wasn't without you. She paused, taking a sip of water. But then slowly I started to fill that space with my own voice, my own ideas. All the things I had kept quiet because I was afraid they weren't big enough or impressive enough for your world. I started verdant living with the $5,000 I had in my personal savings, working from the garage. It turns out my silly hobbies had potential after all. The phrase his own dismissive words hung in the air between them. He flinched, but she didn't seem to say it with malice. It was just a statement of fact. Julian came later, she continued. I was pitching for a second round of funding at a green tech conference. He was the keynote speaker. He heard my pitch, saw the prototype, and he didn't just see a product. He saw the vision behind it. He believed in it. More importantly, he believed in me. The simplicity of it was devastating. He had demanded she fit into his world. Julian had simply stepped into hers and helped her build it bigger. He's a good man, Ethan said quietly. It was an admission of defeat, but also a genuine observation. He's the kindest man I've ever known, she replied. And the way she said it with such simple, unadorned certainty was the final definitive closing of their chapter. He had to ask the question that had been burning in his mind all night. The core idea for verdant living, the biodegradable polymer. You talked to me about that once, didn't you? Years ago. A shadow of a memory crossed her face. Yes, she said. I did. It was just a concept then, something I'd read about in a scientific journal. I was so excited. I sketched it out on a napkin for you at La Trattoria, our old anniversary spot. He remembered. He remembered being annoyed that she was distracted, that she was talking about mushroom packaging when he was trying to celebrate a promotion. What did I say? He asked, though he already knew the answer. He needed to hear the nail being hammered into his coffin. Amelia looked away for a moment out at the ocean, visible through the large ballroom windows. You told me it was a nice thought, but impractical. You said, Ames, you have a good heart, but you don't have a head for business. Stick to what you're good at. And then you crumpled up the napkin and asked the waiter for the check. There it was, the moment, the tiny, seemingly insignificant moment where he had not just dismissed an idea, but dismissed her, the very core of who she was. He hadn't just failed to support her dream. He had actively crushed it, tossing it aside like a piece of trash. And from that discarded napkin, she had built an empire. Julian hadn't given her the idea. He had only nurtured the seed that Ethan had tried to bury. He felt a profound, gut-wrenching shame. It was a shame that went deeper than professional jealousy or social humiliation. It was the shame of a man who had been given a rare, precious gift and had been too arrogant and too blind to recognize its value. I'm sorry, Amelia, he whispered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. For that, for everything, I was a fool. She finally looked back at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of the old familiar softness in her eyes. Yes, you were, she said, not unkindly. But our ending, Ethan, was my beginning. I've made my peace with that. I hope you can too. Julian was walking back towards them. He smiled at Amelia, a private, loving smile, before nodding politely at Ethan. Amelia stood up, placing her hand in her husband's. They were a perfect, seamless unit. Good night, Ethan, she said. And with that they turned and walked away, leaving him alone at the table with the ghost of a crumpled napkin and the full crushing weight of his choices. Watching Amelia and Julian walk away felt like watching the tide go out, leaving him stranded and alone on a barren shore. The music of the party, which had faded into a dull background hum, now returned with a vengeance, each beat of the bass drum a mocking thud against his hollow chest. He stumbled back to the bar, the bartender now giving him a look of weary familiarity. "Another scotch, sir." "Make it a double," Ethan rasped. He drank it quickly, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction from the inferno in his soul. He was no longer just embarrassed or jealous. He was grieving. He was mourning the man he could have been, the life he could have had if he hadn't been so consumed by the shallow metrics of success he'd chosen for himself. He saw Tiffany across the room. She was talking to Marcus Thorne again, laughing a little too loudly, touching his arm a little too often. She was working. Even now, with her fiancé in the midst of an emotional collapse, she was networking, leveraging the situation, ensuring her own position was secure. He saw her in that moment with a terrifying clarity. She wasn't his partner. She was his co-investor in the joint venture of their public image, and his stock was plummeting. He turned away, unable to watch. He wandered through the grand halls of the mansion, his feet carrying him aimlessly. He passed laughing groups of people oblivious to his private agony. He felt invisible, a specter haunting the edges of their joy. He found himself in a library, a quiet wood-paneled room lined with leather-bound books that probably hadn't been opened in a century. He sank into a deep leather armchair that smelled of dust and old paper, the double scotch sloshing in his hand. The conversation with Amelia replayed in his mind, each word a fresh wound. You crumpled up the napkin. How had he been so blind, so arrogant? He had looked at her and seen a limitation, a domestic creature who couldn't comprehend his grand ambitions. He had defined her by her relationship to him, never once considering the vast, uncharted territory of her own potential. He thought he was the protagonist of their story, when in fact he had been the villain in hers, the obstacle she had to overcome to find her own greatness. And Tiffany, he had chosen her because she was the opposite of Amelia. Sharp, ambitious, cynical, she spoke his language. But he realized now that it was a language of transactions, not connections. Their love wasn't a sanctuary. It was a boardroom. Their future wasn't a shared dream. It was a merger. He pulled out his phone. On autopilot, he opened Tiffany's Instagram profile. There it was, the picture from earlier. The future Mr. and Mrs. Hayes. The caption read, followed by a string of hashtags. Wedding vibes. One power couple Mont future is bright. It was a lie. A glossy, filtered, perfectly composed lie. There was no future. Not for them. He couldn't go back to playing that part. The costume no longer fit. The man in that picture, smiling vacantly next to a woman showcasing a diamond ring, was a stranger to him now. He thought of Julian Devo. The man had everything Ethan had ever wanted, wealth beyond measure, power, respect. But he wore it all so lightly. He hadn't been flaunting his success. He had been celebrating his wife's. His power was quiet, confident, rooted in something real. Ethan's was loud, brittle, a desperate performance to convince himself and the world that he mattered. The library door creaked open. It was Tiffany. Her smile was gone, her face hard and stripped of all pretense. "There you are," she said, her voice cold. "Hiding again." "I'm not hiding, Tiffany. I'm thinking." "Thinking about what? How are you going to crawl back to her?" "It's a little late for that, Ethan. The billionaire ship has sailed. This isn't about her anymore," he said, looking up at her. The alcohol had stripped away his own pretenses, leaving only a raw, painful honesty. "This is about us. This what we have, it's not real." She let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. "Not real. The 2-carat diamond on my finger feels pretty real, Ethan. The penthouse we're moving into next month feels real. Everything we've built is real. We haven't built anything," he counted, his voice rising. "We've curated a brand. We've assembled a portfolio. This isn't a relationship. It's a business plan. And I'm cashing out." The color drained from her face. The mask of the ambitious socialite fell away, revealing a woman who was suddenly terrifyingly vulnerable. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I can't do this anymore. I can't be the man in that picture. I don't even know who he is." He stood up, the movement unsteady. "I spent the last 2 years thinking I was trading up, that I was winning, but I was just running. Running from the fact that I wasn't enough for a woman like Amelia. Not because I wasn't rich enough or successful enough, but because I wasn't man enough to see her for who she really was." He looked at Tiffany, and for the first time, he saw not a prize to be won, but another person who had bought into the same lie he had. "And I'm not enough for you either, Tiffany. Not the man you want me to be. You don't want a partner. You want an asset." And this asset is depreciating fast. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of rage and frustration. You're a fool, Ethan. You're throwing away everything for a ghost, for a memory. No, he said, his voice finally steady. I'm throwing away the ghost, the performance. For the first time in a long time, I want something real. He walked past her out of the library and out of the life he had so carefully and so mistakenly constructed. The party was over. The long night of his reckoning had just begun. The drive back to New York was a silent 4-hour ordeal. The air in the car was thick with unspoken accusations and the death of a future. Tiffany stared out her window, a single angry tear tracing a path through her perfect makeup. Ethan just drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the endless stretch of highway ahead. There was nothing left to say. They had already said it all in the library. They parted ways at the entrance to their apartment building, the one he would now be leaving. She slid the diamond ring off her finger and placed it on the empty passenger seat without a word. The gesture was cold, final, and transactional. The end of a deal. The next few weeks were a blur of logistics and introspection. Ethan moved out, finding a smaller, simpler apartment downtown. He put his penthouse up for sale. He went to work, but the thrill of the trading floor, the adrenaline of a hostile takeover, it was all gone. It felt like a game he no longer understood the rules of, or perhaps had never wanted to play in the first place. He was adrift. He had spent so long defining himself by his ambition, by his possessions, by the woman on his arm, that without them he wasn't sure who he was. He was haunted by the man in the mirror, a stranger with tired eyes, and a life full of expensive things that brought him no joy. One rainy Saturday, he found himself unpacking a box of old belongings he'd retrieved from storage, things from his life with Amelia. He found an old photo album. He sat on the floor of his empty new apartment and flipped through the pages. There they were, younger, less polished, but undeniably happy. A picture of them on a hiking trip covered in mud. A picture of them in their first tiny apartment painting the walls themselves. A picture of Amelia in her garden, her face beaming with pride over a row of crooked-looking carrots. He saw it then. The wealth he had thrown away hadn't been monetary. It had been a wealth of shared moments, of simple joys, of authentic connection. He had traded it all for a portfolio of empty victories. He had one final awkward conversation with Tiffany when she came to pick up the last of her things. She was composed, her armor firmly back in place. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Ethan, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Some little slice of authentic middle-class misery, I suppose. I hope you find what you're looking for, too. Tiff, he replied with no malice. He realized he did. He hoped she found a man who wanted to be the asset she was looking for, who would find joy in their shared ambition. She wasn't a villain. She was just a woman who wanted a different life than the one he now knew he needed. After she left, he sat in the silence, feeling not the misery she'd predicted, but a strange, unfamiliar sense of peace. It was the peace of surrender. He had stopped fighting to be someone he wasn't. A few days later, he saw an article online. It was a feature in Forbes titled The Visionaries of Verdant, How Julian and Amelia Devo Are Building a Greener Tomorrow. There was a picture of them standing in a field. Amelia holding a small, thriving sapling. They weren't looking at the camera. They were looking at each other, their smiles genuine and unguarded. The article detailed the incredible work they were doing, not just with her company, but through their new philanthropic foundation dedicated to funding sustainable startups and environmental education. It spoke of Amelia's passion and Julian's unwavering support. The old Ethan would have been consumed by a toxic brew of envy and rage. But the man sitting on the floor of his empty apartment felt something different. He felt a quiet sense of awe, and he smiled. It was a real smile, not for a camera, not for an audience, but for himself. He was genuinely happy for her. Her success no longer felt like a reflection of his failure. It was simply her story, a story he was privileged to have once been a small part of. He closed the laptop. The wedding in Newport had been a funeral, the death of his ego, the death of his illusions, and now, in the quiet aftermath, something new was beginning to grow. He didn't know what his future looked like. It wouldn't be as glossy or as grand as the one he had planned, but he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that it would be his. It would be real, and for the first time in a very long time, that was more than enough. 6 months passed. The seasons turned, painting the city in the muted tones of late autumn. Ethan's life had been stripped down to its essentials. He'd sold the penthouse and the flashy sports car. He'd left his high-pressure job at Hayes Capital, taking a position at a smaller, more ethical investment firm that focused on socially responsible ventures. The pay was a fraction of what he used to make, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he was selling his soul with every transaction. His new apartment was modest, but it had a small balcony. On it, he had placed a few large pots. He'd spent a weekend at a local nursery, awkwardly asking questions about soil and drainage. He was trying to grow tomatoes. Most of the early attempts had withered, but one small plant was now stubbornly bearing tiny green fruit. He found an absurd amount of pride in it. He was rebuilding his life not from the top down, but from the ground up. He reconnected with old friends he had neglected during his relentless climb, the ones who knew him before the ambition had consumed him. He had coffee with his sister, who told him, "It's good to have my brother back. I didn't much care for that CEO you were pretending to be." He was learning to find joy not in acquisition, but in experience. The taste of a well-made coffee, the pleasure of a long run along the river, the satisfaction of helping a small, meaningful company get the funding it needed to grow. His world had become smaller, quieter, and infinitely more profound. One crisp November afternoon, he was walking through a farmer's market in Union Square, enjoying the vibrant chaos. He was buying a loaf of sourdough bread when he heard a familiar voice. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" He turned. It was Amelia. She was alone, dressed in simple jeans and a warm sweater, holding a canvas tote bag filled with fresh vegetables. For a heart-topping moment, the world seemed to slow down. "Amelia," he said, his voice catching slightly. "Ethan," she smiled, a warm, easy smile that held no ghosts. "Fancy meeting you here." I live nearby now," he said, gesturing vaguely, trying out the simple life. He meant it as a self-deprecating joke, but it was the truth. "It's not so simple, is it?" she said, her eyes twinkling. "It takes a lot more work to grow a carrot than to short a stock." He laughed, a genuine, unforced laugh. "You have no idea. I'm currently at war with aphids on my tomato plant. Try a little neem oil," she suggested easily, "and talk to them. They like the attention." They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, the bustling market swirling around them. It wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. Two people who had once shared a life now standing as two separate whole individuals. "I saw the Forbes article," he said. "What you're doing is amazing. Truly." "Thank you," she said. "It feels good. It feels like what I was always meant to be doing." She paused, her gaze thoughtful. "You look good, Ethan. You look calm." It was the highest compliment he could have received. Not successful, not powerful, not rich. Calm. "I'm getting there," he admitted. "It's a process. Unlearning a lot of bad habits." "Life is a process," she agreed. "Julian is in town for a conference. We're just trying to steal a few normal moments, like buying overpriced kale." She held up a large bunch with a grin. He smiled back. There was no jealousy, no regret, just a quiet appreciation for this woman and the journey she had taken. He was grateful to have known her, grateful for the brutal necessary lesson she had inadvertently taught him. She had been the catalyst for his own transformation. "Well," she said, shifting her bag, "I should go. He'll be wondering where I've gotten to." "It was good to see you, Amelia. Really good." "You too, Ethan." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. He watched her go, a feeling of profound peace settling over him. He hadn't needed her forgiveness to be free. He had needed to forgive himself. He paid for his bread, the warmth of the loaf seeping into his hands. He looked down at his own hands. No flashy watch, no signs of a fresh manicure. They were just hands. Hands that could now tell the difference between good soil and bad. Hands that were learning slowly how to build things that last. He had a long way to go, but for the first time, he was walking in the right direction on a path of his own, making towards a future that felt authentic and true. And that was a treasure no amount of money could ever